Some prayers are answered with miracles, others with curses that outlive generations. The wind screamed across the Montana peaks like the voices of the dead, carrying snow thick enough to bury a man standing upright. In the shadow of Grizzly Ridge, where the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in 6 weeks, Ezra Thornfield's compound sat like a scar against the white wilderness, a fortress of rough-hewn logs and iron bars that had already claimed 3 women's lives. Naia Blackwater pressed her chained hands against the stone wall of her cell, feeling the ancient power stirring in her blood like fire beneath ice. For 7 years, she'd hidden her Cherokee grandmother's gift, the ability to weave life from the spirit realm into flesh and bone. But now, with her sister and nephew locked in the barn and this mountain devil demanding the impossible, that power was her only weapon. Thornfield wanted 5 sons before spring thaw. He had no idea that granting his wish would tear open doorways that had been sealed since the massacre at Crow Creek, doorways that hungry spirits had been clawing at for decades. Outside, something howled that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite wolf. What happens when the very power meant to create life becomes a gateway for the restless dead seeking justice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The howling ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete that Naia could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. She pulled her hands back from the cold rock, watching her breath cloud in the frigid air of what had once been a root cellar before Thornfield converted it into a prison. 7 years of careful hiding, 7 years of pretending to be nothing more than another broken Cherokee woman swept up in the endless tide of displacement and bondage. 7 years of watching white settlers treat her people's sacred knowledge like superstition, while they stripped the land bare and built their empires on stolen bones. The power in her bloodline stretched back 15 generations, passed down through the women of her clan like a sacred trust. Her grandmother, Ayanna, had been the last true keeper before the soldiers came, before Crow Creek, before the massacre that had sent her grandmother's spirit and dozens of others screaming into the space between worlds, unable to find peace while their sacred grounds lay desecrated. The gift is not meant for forcing, Ayanna had whispered during those final lessons, her weathered hands guiding young Naia's fingers through the intricate patterns of the weaving ritual. Life calls to life. We are merely the bridge. But if the bridge is built with violence, with greed, with hatred— She had shuddered then, her dark eyes reflecting something terrible. Then what crosses over may not be what was intended. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow above, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the low rumble of men's voices. Thornfield's riders, returning from their patrol of the compound's perimeter. 3 men who followed him not out of loyalty but out of fear, and the promise of gold when spring came. 3 men who had helped him drag Cherokee families from their winter shelters, sorting them like livestock. The cellar door groaned open, and lamplight spilled down the wooden stairs like liquid amber. Thornfield's massive frame filled the doorway, his bare fur coat making him appear even larger against the storm-dark sky behind him. Ice crystals clung to his black beard, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. "Time we had ourselves a proper conversation, Cherokee." His voice carried the educated accent of back east money, which made Hist's howl faded into the wind's relentless shriek, leaving behind a silence that felt more dangerous than the storm itself. Naia closed her eyes and let her breathing slow, drawing on the meditation techniques her grandmother had taught her in the hidden valleys of Tennessee, back when the world still held places where Cherokee feet could walk freely. "Feel the heartbeat beneath your heartbeat," Grandmother Ayanna's voice whispered across the years. "Listen to the blood song that connects all living things." Even through the stone walls, Naia could sense the life forces moving through Thornfield's compound like threads in a vast, dark tapestry. Her sister Kaya's pulse fluttered weak but steady from the barn, exhaustion and fear bleeding through their blood connection. Little Joseph, barely 8 years old, slept fitfully beside her, his child's dreams haunted by images of the riders who had torn them from their hiding place in the foothills. Thornfield's presence burned like a brand in her awareness, his massive frame pacing somewhere above her head. The man was a walking storm of rage and desperation, his very soul stained with the blood of the women who had died, trying to give him the sons he craved. Sarah, who had bled out in the depths of January. Maria, who had simply stopped breathing during the February blizzards, and sweet Elizabeth, barely 17, whose heart had given out just 3 weeks ago when the mountain cold seeped into her bones. All of them buried now beneath the snow behind the compound, their graves marked with crude wooden crosses that would rot come spring. If spring ever came. The iron shackles around Naia's wrists had worn bloody rings in her skin, but she barely felt the pain anymore. 7 years of bondage had taught her to separate her spirit from her flesh, to find freedom in the spaces between heartbeats, even when her body remained trapped. It was a skill that had kept her alive through the slave markets of St. Louis, through the brutal hands of 3 different masters, before Thornfield had claimed her from a poker game last autumn. None of them had suspected what ran in her veins. None of them had known that the quiet Cherokee woman, who tended their sick animals and brewed healing teas, carried the bloodline of the first mothers, the ancient women who had walked between worlds when the continent was young and spirits moved freely among the living. The power had awakened in Naia on her 16th birthday, manifesting first as an ability to sense pregnancy in its earliest moments, to feel the spark of new life taking hold in a woman's womb. Her grandmother had wept with joy and terror in equal measure, recognizing the signs that had not appeared in their family line for 3 generations. With great gifts come great dangers, Ayana had warned her. The old ways demand balance. Life called forth too quickly, forced from the spirit realm before its proper time. Such workings leave doors ajar that should remain sealed. But Thornfield cared nothing for Cherokee wisdom or ancient warnings. When he had discovered her gift 2 days ago, using it instinctively to save a mare struggling with a difficult birth, his eyes had lit with a hunger more terrifying than any physical desire. The man who had buried 3 wives suddenly saw salvation in the hands of his Cherokee slave. 5 sons before winter's end. The demand was madness, an impossibility that would require her to reach deep into the forbidden aspects of her power, to call forth life with a speed and intensity that went against every natural law. And yet, it might be the only chance she had to save Kaya and Joseph. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her cell, heavy boots that could only belong to one man. Naia opened her eyes as torchlight flickered beyond the barred window of her door, casting dancing shadows against the rough stone walls. "I know you're awake in there," Thornfield's voice rumbled through the darkness, thick with the whiskey he'd been drowning himself in since Elizabeth's death. "Been thinking about our arrangement, have you?" Naia remained silent, though her heart rate quickened. The man's presence always brought with it an aura of barely contained violence, like a wildfire held in check by nothing more than will and circumstance. "Saw what you did with that mare," he continued. "Twin foals, both breathing strong, when any fool could see she was dying. That's not natural. That's something else entirely." The door creaked open, and Thornfield's massive silhouette filled the frame. In the torchlight, his bearded face looked like something carved from granite, all harsh angles and deep shadows. The mountain cold had turned his breath to visible mist, and ice crystals glittered in his dark hair. "Time to discuss terms, Cherokee woman. Your family's lives against my future. Seems like a fair trade to me." Beyond the compound walls, that strange howl echoed across the peaks again. Closer this time, and hungry. The negotiation for souls was about to begin. Naia remained motionless against the stone wall, her dark eyes fixed on Thornfield's massive frame. The torchlight carved deep shadows beneath his prominent brow, making his pale eyes appear to glow like winter stars. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful weapon a captive woman possessed. It forced men like him to fill the quiet with their own fears and desires. "Nothing to say?" Thornfield stepped into the cellar, his boots scraping against the rough stone floor. The space seemed to shrink around his presence, 6 feet and 4 inches of mountain-bred muscle and barely leashed violence. Your silence won't save them, you know. That sister of yours is already half dead from the cold, and the boy—" He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. The blood song in Naia's veins quickened, and she felt Kaya's pulse flutter in response across the compound. Their connection had always been strong. Twin souls born 18 months apart, their grandmother used to say. Even now, separated by stone walls and iron bars, Naia could sense her sister's growing desperation, could feel the way hunger and fear were eating away at her strength like acid. "I've been thinking about what you showed me with that mare," Thornfield continued, crouching down until his face was level with hers. His breath reeked of whiskey and something rotten underneath, the smell of a man whose soul had begun to decay while his body still walked. That wasn't luck. That wasn't some Cherokee herb nonsense. That was power. Naia's fingers traced the worn stone beneath her, feeling the echo of her grandmother's lessons in the texture of the rock. Power shared carelessly becomes a chain, child. The moment they know what we can do, we cease to be people and become tools. 7 years she had hidden her gift, even when it meant watching animals suffer, even when it meant biting her tongue as white doctors bled their patients to death with their ignorant practices. 7 years of choking down the instinct to heal, to nurture, to bridge the gap between the world of spirit and flesh. The effort had carved hollow spaces in her chest, places where unused power pooled like stagnant water. "My wives." Thornfield's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They tried their best. Sarah lasted 6 months before the bleeding took her. Maria made it through 1 birth, but the baby was weak, died before his first week ended. And Elizabeth, his massive hands clenched into fists. Sweet Elizabeth, who deserved better than this God-forsaken mountain, and a broken man for a husband. For just a moment, something almost human flickered across his features. Grief, perhaps, or the ghost of whatever gentleness he might have possessed before the wilderness stripped it away. But the vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator. "You're going to give me what they couldn't," he said. 5 sons. Strong ones who can survive this country, who can build something lasting on this land. This stolen land, Naia thought but did not say. The mountain beneath them still remembered Cherokee footsteps, still held the echoes of ceremonies performed in hidden valleys before Thornfield's kind had claimed it all with guns and paper treaties worth less than the ink used to sign them. She could feel the ancestral spirits stirring in the space between worlds, drawn by the mention of forbidden workings. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through the stone, "The dead grow restless when the living forget the proper ways." "What makes you think I can do what you ask?" Naia finally spoke, her voice rusty from disuse. "What makes you think such power even exists?" Thornfield's laugh was like rocks grinding together. "Because I've seen what desperation can accomplish. Because I know your people had ways of working with nature that mine never bothered to learn. And because," his voice hardened, "you're going to try, or I'll start cutting pieces off your family until you do." The howl came again from somewhere beyond the compound walls. Longer this time, more mournful, like something calling to its lost kin. Naia felt her skin prickle with recognition. The sound carried undertones that most white ears couldn't detect, harmonics that spoke of old hungers and older griefs. "Time's wasting, Cherokee." Thornfield stood, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. "Winter's got maybe 2 months left in her, and I mean to see 5 sons born before the snow melts. You'll start tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Naia closed her eyes and reached out with her gift, feeling for the life forces that pulsed through the compound. Kaya's heartbeat, Joseph's shallow breathing, the 3 hired guns sleeping off their whiskey in the bunkhouse. And there, something else. Something that didn't quite belong to the world of the living, but hadn't yet crossed fully into death. The spirits were gathering, drawn by the scent of forbidden workings yet to come. The negotiation for souls was indeed about to begin, but perhaps not in the way Ezra Thornfield imagined. The spirits were gathering, drawn by the scent of forbidden workings yet to come. But as Thornfield's footsteps faded into the corridor above, Naia felt something else stirring in the darkness. something that made her blood run cold, despite the power that coursed through her veins. The howling beyond the compound walls had fallen silent, replaced by a different sound entirely, the soft crunch of footsteps in fresh snow, moving with purpose toward the main gate. Riders, more than one, from the rhythm of their approach. Naia pressed her palms against the stone floor and extended her awareness outward, feeling for the life forces approaching through the storm. 3 distinct heartbeats, strong and steady despite the bitter cold. But there was something else threading through their life songs. Something that made her grandmother's warnings echo with new urgency in her mind. These were not ordinary travelers seeking shelter from the blizzard. The compound erupted into sudden activity above her head, boots pounding across wooden floors, harsh voices shouting orders, the metallic click of rifles being cocked. Through the narrow window of her cell, she could see torchlight dancing wildly as Thornfield's men scrambled to defensive positions. "Boss!" The voice belonged to Dutch Kellerman, Thornfield's lieutenant, a scarred man who had followed him up from the Colorado goldfields. 3 riders at the gate. They're flying a white flag, but they're armed heavy. Thornfield's roar shook the entire building. "What do they want?" "To parley, they say. Claims they got business with you about the Cherokee woman." "About me?" Naia's heart stuttered in her chest. In 7 years of captivity, no one had ever come seeking her specifically. Her family had been scattered to the 4 winds after Crow Creek, most presumed dead or lost to the reservations. Who could possibly know she was here? The answer came to her with the force of a physical blow, carried on the wind that howled through the cracks in the stone walls. Mixed with the scent of snow and pine, she caught something else. Sage smoke and sweetgrass, the lingering traces of sacred ceremonies performed in hidden places. Cherokee. These riders were Cherokee. But how had they found her? And what did they want with a woman who had spent 7 years hiding her true nature, denying her heritage to survive in the white world? Above, she could hear Thornfield pacing like a caged bear, his massive frame making the floorboards groan. "Tell them to state their business and ride on. I don't have time for visitors." "Sir," Dutch's voice carried a note of unease that Naia had never heard before. "One of them, I think he might be military. Got the bearing, if you know what I mean. And he's asking for the woman by name. Naia Blackwater, he said, knows her bloodline." The silence that followed was so complete that Naia could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. Her true name, the name her grandmother had whispered over her cradle, the name that connected her to 15 generations of power. She had not heard it spoken aloud since the day soldiers dragged her from the hidden valley where her people had tried to make their last stand. Thornfield's voice, when it came, was deadly quiet. "How does a Cherokee rider know my slave's bloodline?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Naia had been hiding, everything she had sacrificed to keep her family alive. The power in her veins was not just a gift, it was a responsibility, a sacred trust that belonged to her people as much as it belonged to her. And if Cherokee riders had come seeking her in the depths of a Montana winter, it could only mean one thing. The spirits she had sensed gathering in the darkness were not just drawn by the prospect of forbidden ceremonies. They were answering a call that had been sent out across the spirit paths, a summons that her people used only in the direst circumstances. Someone knew what Thornfield was planning to force her to do, and someone was coming to stop it. The realization hit her like ice water in her veins. This was the moment her grandmother had warned her about, the crossroads where every choice would carry consequences that rippled far beyond her own survival. She could feel the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a burial shroud, the sense that forces much larger than one woman's captivity were beginning to move. Through the stone walls, she felt Kaya's heartbeat quicken with sudden hope, as if her sister too had sensed the shift in the wind. Little Joseph stirred in his sleep, murmuring words in Cherokee that he was too young to understand, but old enough to remember in his bones. The howling began again, closer now, and threaded with harmonies that spoke of ancient hunger's awakening. Whatever was coming with these riders, it would change everything. The careful balance Naia had maintained for 7 years, survival bought with silence, life preserved through self-denial, was about to shatter like ice beneath spring sun. The call to adventure had arrived on the mountain wind, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and sacred smoke, old promises and older debts. Time was running out, and the choice that would define not just her fate, but the fate of everyone in Thornfield's compound was racing toward her through the storm. But as the weight of destiny settled around her, like chains forged from starlight and shadow, Naia found herself frozen between hope and terror. The Cherokee riders beyond the walls represented everything she had tried to forget: her true name, her sacred bloodline, the responsibilities she had abandoned to keep her family breathing. 7 years of careful invisibility, 7 years of swallowing her power like poison, and now her past had found her at the worst possible moment. What if they've come to stop me from saving Kaya and Joseph? The thought struck her like a physical blow. Her people's ways demanded balance, patience, respect for the natural order. The ceremonies Thornfield wanted her to perform, accelerating conception and birth beyond all natural limits, would violate every sacred law her grandmother had taught her. If the Cherokee Council had somehow learned of Thornfield's demands, they might have come not to rescue her, but to prevent her from unleashing forces that could tear holes between the worlds. Through the blood bond with her sister, Naia felt Kaya's hope blazing like a candle flame in winter darkness. But that hope only deepened her anguish. How could she explain to a dying woman that salvation might require damnation, that the choice between family and sacred duty was no choice at all, but a trap with teeth that would devour whatever path she chose? Above, Thornfield's voice boomed through the compound. "Tell those Cherokee bastards they can freeze in hell before I give up what's mine. And if they're not gone by dawn, we'll send them to join their ancestors the hard way." The casual cruelty in his words made something dark unfurl in Naia's chest. Not power, but the absence of it. The hollow spaces where 7 years of unused gifts had carved out caverns of resentment and rage. Part of her wanted to let the ceremonies tear holes in reality. Part of her wanted to watch the spirits of the murdered earth rise up and drag every white settler screaming into the shadow realm. But that part of her was exactly what her grandmother had warned against. The greatest danger is not that the power will fail you, child, but that you will use it for the wrong reasons. Anger is a poison that turns gifts into curses. The sound of horses moving beyond the walls told her the Cherokee riders were withdrawing for now, but she could still feel them out there in the storm, waiting, watching, preparing for whatever came next. Their presence changed everything and nothing. Thornfield would not be deterred by threats or negotiations. If anything, knowing that others sought his prize would only make him more desperate, more dangerous. 5 sons, before winter's end. The impossibility of it crashed over her again. Even with her gifts, even if she threw aside every prohibition and taboo, the human body could only be pushed so far. Pregnancy took time, months that Thornfield didn't have. To compress that cycle into weeks would require reaching so deep into the spirit realm that she might never find her way back. And what would be born from such workings? The ancestors spoke in whispers of children called forth too quickly, beings caught between flesh and spirit, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Her great-grandmother had told stories of the shadow-born, creatures that looked human, but carried the hunger of the void in their hearts, growing stronger with each life they consumed. Was that what Thornfield truly wanted? Sons that would outlive winter, not through strength, but through an appetite that would devour everything in their path. Through her connection to Kaya, Naia felt her sister's pulse growing weaker. Time was indeed running out, but not just for Thornfield's mad demands. Each day of cold and starvation carved away more of her family's strength. Soon the choice would be made for her by death itself. The cell door creaked, and Dutch Kellerman's scarred face appeared in the torchlight. "Boss wants to see you upstairs. Says it's time to get started." Terror and anticipation warred in her chest as she struggled to her feet, iron shackles scraping against stone. In a few minutes, she would stand before Thornfield and either accept his bargain or watch him begin killing the only family she had left. The Cherokee riders beyond the walls offered the possibility of rescue, but at what cost? And could she trust them to save Kaya and Joseph, or would they sacrifice 2 lives to prevent a greater catastrophe? As Dutch hauled her toward the stairs, Naia closed her eyes and reached out with her gift one last time, feeling for the network of life that connected all living things. Somewhere in that web of heartbeats and breath, there had to be another path, a way to save her family without dooming the world, a choice that honored both love and duty. But as she climbed toward whatever waited above, the spirits gathering in the darkness whispered a different truth. Some crossroads offered no good choices, only the courage to choose which price she was willing to pay. The moment of decision was at hand. The stairs groaned beneath Dutch's boots as he dragged her upward, each step carrying Naia further from the familiar darkness of her cell and closer to whatever waited in Thornfield's domain above. The iron shackles around her ankles had rubbed her skin raw over the years, but tonight their weight felt different, not just chains binding her body, but the last tangible connection to the powerless woman she had pretended to be. That pretense was about to die. The main hall of the compound sprawled before her like a predator's den, all rough-hewn timber and trophy skulls mounted on smoke-blackened walls. A massive stone fireplace dominated one end, its flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life. Thornfield stood before it like some ancient barbarian king, his enormous frame silhouetted against the orange glow, but it was what lay spread across the heavy oak table that made Naia's breath catch in her throat. Bones, not human, elk, deer, bear, but arranged in patterns that spoke to something deeper than mere decoration. Someone had attempted to recreate the sacred geometries her grandmother had taught her, the ritual frameworks that channeled power between the worlds of flesh and spirit. The execution was crude, ignorant, but the intent was unmistakable. Thornfield had been preparing for this moment far longer than she had realized. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from the bone circle. "We have work to do." Dutch shoved her into the seat, the wood cold against her back through the thin fabric of her dress. Around the table's perimeter, crude symbols had been carved into the oak, not Cherokee, but something older, more primal. The sight of them made her skin crawl with recognition. These were the markings her great-grandmother had forbidden her to even speak of, the signs used by those who had turned their gifts to darker purposes. "Where did you learn these patterns?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. Thornfield's smile was all teeth, from the last Cherokee woman who refused to help me. Amazing how cooperative someone becomes when you start removing their fingers one by one. She told me quite a lot before she died. The words hit Naia like a physical blow. Another of her people had been here, had suffered at this madman's hands, had died trying to protect the very secrets he now demanded from her. The hollow spaces in her chest began to fill with something darker than rage, a cold, purposeful fury that tasted of copper and starlight. "Got control," her grandmother's voice whispered. "Channel the anger, child. Do not let it channel you." But control felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Through the walls, she could sense her sister's life force flickering like a candle in wind. Outside, the Cherokee riders waited in the storm, their presence a reminder of duties she had tried to abandon. And here, in this mockery of a sacred space, a monster who wore human skin demanded she birth abominations that would devour the world. "The riders who came tonight," Thornfield continued, settling his bulk into the chair across from her. "They knew your true name, your bloodline. That tells me you're more important than I originally thought." His eyes glittered in the firelight. "Which means you're more valuable, and more dangerous if I let you go." The unspoken threat hung between them like smoke. Even if she performed his ceremonies, even if she gave him what he wanted, he would never release her. She had seen too much, knew too much. The moment the last of his sons drew breath, Naia Blackwater would die, unless she chose a different path entirely. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through reality itself. She felt the change immediately. The spirits gathering in the shadows pressed closer, drawn by the scent of bargains about to be struck. The bone circle on the table began to resonate with barely perceptible harmonics, responding to power that had been held in check for far too long. Thornfield leaned forward, his massive hands flat on the scarred wood. Just like that? No more defiance? No noble speeches about your people's ways? My sister is dying, Naia said, and the simple truth of it cut deeper than any blade. My nephew grows weaker with each day. If performing these rituals keeps them alive long enough for rescue to come, then I'll pay whatever price the spirits demand. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were only half the truth. Yes, she would perform the ceremonies, but not the way Thornfield imagined. The patterns carved into his table, the crude bone arrangements, the symbols stolen from a tortured woman's lips. All of it could be turned, twisted, made to serve purposes he would never understand until it was far too late. The Cherokee riders beyond the walls had not come to stop her. They had come to bear witness to what she was about to unleash. Then we begin tonight, Thornfield declared, triumph evident in his voice. Dutch, bring up the first woman. It's time to see what 7 years of hiding your true nature has cost you, Cherokee. As footsteps echoed down the stairs to retrieve the first sacrifice, Naia closed her eyes and felt the last of her old life slip away like smoke on the wind. The threshold had been crossed. The journey into darkness had begun, and somewhere in the space between worlds, ancient powers began to stir. The first woman Dutch brought up was barely more than a girl, perhaps 19, with corn silk hair and terror-bright blue eyes that darted around the hall like a trapped animal seeking escape. Her name was Martha, and she had been taken from a homestead 3 days' ride south when her husband failed to pay a gambling debt. The bruises on her arms told the story of her captivity, and the hollow look in her gaze spoke of hope already murdered. Naia felt the girl's fear like acid in her throat, but forced herself to remain seated as Dutch shoved Martha toward the table. This was the first test, not of her power, but of her resolve. Could she touch another woman with gifts that would forever change her, knowing that failure meant death for them all? "Get on with it," Thornfield growled, but there was uncertainty beneath his bluster now. He had seen the symbols drawn, heard the words spoken by his previous victim, but understanding the mechanics of sacred power was like trying to hold lightning in a bottle. Do whatever you Cherokee witches do to make babies grow fast. The ignorance in his words might have been laughable if the stakes weren't so deadly. Naia rose slowly, her shackles clanking against the stone floor, and moved to stand beside Martha. The girl flinched at her approach, and Naia couldn't blame her. To white eyes, she must look like a creature from their darkest stories, the savage medicine woman, the heathen witch who danced with devils. "I won't hurt you," Naia whispered in English, then repeated the words in Cherokee, though she doubted Martha understood. What she didn't say was that hurt and harm were different things entirely, and what she was about to do would change this girl in ways that went deeper than flesh. Placing her palms flat on the crude bone circle, Naia began to reach for the power she had denied for 7 years. It came reluctantly at first, like water from a poisoned well, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every compromise, every small surrender that had kept her family breathing. But as her gifts unfurled, she felt something else flowing through the connection, guidance from the Cherokee riders beyond the walls. They weren't just witnesses, they were anchors. Through some working she couldn't fully comprehend, the warriors outside had woven themselves into a protective pattern around the compound, their combined will forming a net to catch her if she fell too deep into the shadow realm. She wasn't alone in this horror. Her people had come not to stop her, but to ensure she survived what came next. The revelation gave her courage to reach deeper. Power flooded through the bone circle like fire through dry kindling, and the crude symbols Thornfield had carved into his table blazed with sudden phosphorescence. Martha gasped as energy washed over her, but instead of the violent transformation Thornfield expected, Naia felt something else taking shape, a more subtle working, one that would serve her true purpose rather than his demands. "What's happening?" Martha whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I feel strange." "Conception," Naia said loud enough for Thornfield to hear, but the truth was more complex. She had indeed planted a seed of life within the girl, but it was wrapped in protections and bindings that would prevent the accelerated growth Thornfield craved. This child would develop naturally, safely, and when the time came for birth, it would carry within its blood a connection to powers that would remember this night. Thornfield leaned forward eagerly. How long? When will she show? 7 days for the first signs, Naia lied smoothly. 3 weeks for the birth. Impossible time frames that would buy her precious time to plan, to prepare, to turn this twisted game against its architect. The Cherokee riders would understand. She was building something larger than rescue, weaving a trap that would span the space between worlds. But as she spoke the words, pain lanced through her skull like a hot knife. The connection to the spirit realm was deeper than she had ever attempted before, and she could feel pieces of herself being pulled into the void between worlds. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her mind. Every working has a price, child. The greater the miracle, the more of yourself you must sacrifice to achieve it. Dutch hauled Martha away, leaving Naia swaying on her feet as the power slowly receded. Through the walls, she felt Kaya's pulse strengthen slightly. The spiritual energy she had channeled was feeding all the connections in her blood, giving her sister a few more precious days of life. Impressive, Thornfield said, but his eyes held a calculating gleam that made her skin crawl. But if you think you can play games with me, Cherokee, think again. I had your predecessor demonstrate her gifts too, before I started cutting pieces off. I know when I'm being lied to. The threat was clear, but Naia found she was no longer afraid. The Cherokee riders had given her something beyond hope. They had given her purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing for war. Bring me the next woman, she said quietly. We have work to do. The real test was just beginning. Dutch returned within the hour, this time dragging a woman who looked closer to Naia's age, auburn-haired, defiant, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked hard earth. She carried herself differently than Martha, her spine straight despite the rope burns around her wrists. When their eyes met across the bone-carved table, Naia saw recognition flash between them, not of faces, but of shared understanding. This woman had already guessed what was coming. Sarah McKinnon, Thornfield announced, settling back into his chair like a king enjoying theatre. Took her from a trading post near Helena. Husband put up quite a fight before Dutch put him down. The casual mention of murder rolled off his tongue like commentary on weather. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Get on with it then, she said, her voice steady as river stones. Whatever devil's work you're planning, I won't give you the satisfaction of begging. The woman's courage was a blade in Naia's chest. Here stood someone who faced certain violation with dignity intact, and Naia was about to become the instrument of that violation, even if her true purpose remained hidden. The weight of necessary evils settled on her shoulders like a burial shroud. But as she prepared to reach for her power again, something shifted in the air around them. The phosphorescent symbols on the table flickered, their light dimming as if responding to some distant disturbance. Through the walls, she felt the Cherokee riders moving, not retreating, but repositioning themselves in patterns that spoke of deeper ceremony. They were beginning their own working. The realization sent electricity through her veins. Whatever trap she was weaving from within these walls, her people were building its foundation from without. The convergence would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and a willingness to walk so close to the edge of damnation that a single misstep would doom them all. Second thoughts, Cherokee? Thornfield's voice carried a dangerous edge. Maybe you need motivation to stay focused. He nodded to Dutch, who produced a knife from his belt. Not the utilitarian blade of a mountain man, but something older, cruder. Bone handle wrapped in strips of what looked disturbingly like human hair. As Dutch drew the edge across his palm, drops of blood spattered onto the table, and the carved symbols blazed back to life with renewed hunger. Blood calls to blood, Thornfield said, and Naia's grandmother's warnings crashed over her like ice water. That Cherokee bitch who came before you taught me that much before she died. She said power flows stronger when it's fed with pain. The casual revelation that he had tortured sacred knowledge from one of her people sent rage flooding through Naia's chest, but this time she didn't fight to control it. Instead, she let the fury feed into her connection to the spirit realm, using it as fuel for what came next. Her predecessor's sacrifice would not be meaningless. The knowledge stolen through torment would become the very weapon that brought Thornfield's destruction. Placing her hands on Sarah's shoulders, Naia began the second ceremony. But this time, as power flowed between them, she wove something different into the working. Not just protection for the child that would come, but a binding that connected Sarah to the growing network of spiritual energy surrounding the compound. Each woman she touched became another thread in a web that would eventually span both worlds. Sarah gasped as the power touched her. But instead of fear, Naia sensed something else in the woman's response: recognition. Somehow, impossibly, Sarah could feel the true nature of what was happening. "How?" Sarah whispered in a voice too low for Thornfield to hear. "Scottish blood," Naia breathed back, understanding flooding through her. "You have the sight." The revelation changed everything. If Sarah carried even a trace of the old Highland gifts, she could serve as more than just another victim. She could become an active participant in their escape. The network Naia was building suddenly had a new anchor point, one that might prove crucial when the time came to spring their trap. 3 weeks, Naia announced again as the ceremony concluded, but this time she caught Sarah's eye as she spoke. The woman nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming she understood the deception. Thornfield's satisfaction was palpable as Dutch led Sarah away. 2 down, 3 to go. At this rate, we'll have the full litter started before the storm breaks. He leaned forward, firelight dancing across his scarred features. "Tell me, Cherokee, when they're born, will they carry your gifts, or will they be mine entirely?" The question revealed more about his true intentions than any threat could have. He wasn't just demanding sons. He was trying to breed a line of power he could control, children who would inherit supernatural abilities without the cultural knowledge to use them properly. The thought of such gifts in the hands of someone raised by Thornfield made her stomach turn. "Power follows blood," she said carefully, "but it chooses its own masters." Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and through her connection to the Cherokee riders, Naia felt their ceremony reaching its first crescendo. Soon, very soon, the real test would begin. Thornfield's laugh cut through the howling wind like breaking glass. "Power chooses its own masters? We'll see about that." He heaved himself from his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. "Dutch, bring them all up. Every last woman. It's time our Cherokee witch learned what happens when someone tries to play games with me." The words sent ice through Naia's veins. She had bought herself precious time with the deceptions, but if he forced her to perform all 5 ceremonies tonight, the spiritual drain would kill her before dawn. And worse, it would tear holes in the barrier between worlds that even the Cherokee riders couldn't contain. Heavy footsteps echoed from below as Dutch descended to the cellars. Through the floorboards, she could hear muffled sobbing, the clank of chains, whispered prayers in languages both familiar and foreign. How many women had he captured? How many lives hung in the balance of whatever choice she made next? The bone circle on the table pulsed with malevolent energy, fed by Dutch's blood and Thornfield's twisted ambitions. But beneath its crude hunger, Naia sensed something else stirring. The ancient protections her people had woven around the compound were responding to the spiritual disturbance, drawing power from sources Thornfield could never comprehend. "Now, granddaughter." The voice came not from memory this time, but from the shadows themselves, carrying the weight of ancestors who had walked between worlds for generations uncounted. "The moment of choosing is upon you." Through the walls, she felt the Cherokee riders complete their positioning. 7 warriors standing at the cardinal points and the sacred crossroads, their combined will forming a net to catch what she was about to unleash. They weren't here to rescue her. They were here to ensure that when she fell into darkness, something would remain to pull her back. Dutch's boots thundered on the stairs as he hauled the first of 3 remaining women into the firelight. This one was barely conscious, her dark hair matted with dried blood. wearing the remnants of what had once been a traveling dress. Behind her came two others, one scarcely more than a child, the other a woman with silver threading through auburn hair who carried herself with the dignity of someone who had already made peace with death. "All of them," Thornfield commanded, his scarred face gleaming with anticipation. "5 suns before dawn, or I start cutting pieces off your sister," beginning with her fingers. The threat landed like a physical blow, but as Naia staggered under its impact, she felt something shift in the spiritual landscape around them. The crude symbols carved into Thornfield's table began to resonate with frequencies that had nothing to do with his stolen knowledge. Power was building, not just from her gifts, but from the convergence of bloodlines and broken spirits that filled this cursed hall. "You want to see Cherokee magic?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You want to witness the power you've been so desperate to control?" "Get on with it," Thornfield snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Something in her tone had changed, carrying harmonics that made the very air tremble. Naia stepped forward, placing her palms flat on the bone circle. But instead of reaching for the familiar channels of her heritage, she opened herself to everything: the pain of the women chained before her, the rage of spirits denied justice, the ancient fury of a land soaked in innocent blood. The power that answered her call was vast, terrible, and utterly beyond her ability to control. The table exploded into light. Phosphorescent fire raced along the carved symbols, but instead of following Thornfield's crude patterns, it rewrote them, transforming stolen secrets into something that belonged to older, darker purposes. The bone circle began to spin without any hand touching it, and the temperature in the hall plummeted until their breath came out in silver clouds. Through the spiritual connection, she felt the Cherokee riders pour their strength into her working, not to limit what she was doing, but to ensure she could channel forces that would otherwise consume her completely. They had known this moment would come. They had prepared for it. "What are you doing?" Thornfield's voice cracked with the first real fear she had heard from him. "Stop this! I command you to—" His words cut off as every candle in the hall flared simultaneously, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The women chained before the table gasped as spiritual energy washed over them, but instead of the violation Thornfield intended, they felt something else: protection settling into their bones like armor, bindings that would shield them from whatever came next. Because Naia had finally understood the true nature of the trap her people had been weaving. She wasn't just the bait, she was the trigger. Every ceremony performed in this mockery of a sacred space had been building toward this moment, creating a confluence of power that could tear the barrier between worlds wide enough for ancient justices to flow through. The ordeal that would test everything she had learned was beginning, and its outcome would reshape the very fabric of reality itself. The barriers between worlds didn't tear, they shattered. What erupted from the spinning bone circle wasn't the controlled spiritual energy Naia had wielded before, but something vast and hungry that had been waiting decades for this moment of weakness between realms. The protective net the Cherokee riders had woven around the compound held for perhaps 3 heartbeats before the torrent of ancient fury overwhelmed it completely. Naia felt the spiritual backlash hit her like a physical blow, driving her to her knees as power she couldn't contain ripped through her body. Blood streamed from her nose, her ears, the corners of her eyes. Through the connection to her people outside, she felt their agonized cries as the feedback tore through their ceremony, scattering warriors who had stood strong against winter storms and cavalry charges. But the worst realization came as the shadows in the hall began to take shape. These weren't the spirits of her ancestors responding to her call. These were something else entirely, older and infinitely more malevolent. The sacred site Thornfield had built his compound upon hadn't belonged to the Cherokee at all. It had been a place of binding, where her people's predecessors had imprisoned something that should never have been released. "What have you done?" Thornfield roared, but his voice was nearly lost beneath the sound that filled the air, a keening wail that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through the floorboards and walls, like the death cry of something unimaginably vast. The shadows coalesced into forms that hurt to look at, directly, ancient things that had been locked away when the world was younger, and the barriers between realms were stronger. They flowed across the hall like living darkness, and everything they touched began to wither. The wooden beams overhead cracked with frost. The stone walls sprouted patches of ice that spread like cancer. One of the bound women screamed as a shadow form passed through her, but instead of offering harm, it paused, as if recognizing something familiar. These entities had been imprisoned so long they had forgotten the distinction between oppressor and victim. They saw only living humans in a place that had once been theirs, and their hunger for revenge was indiscriminate. "The binding!" Naia gasped, trying to reach for her power again, but the spiritual channels that had always answered her call were shattered. The backlash had burned out something essential in her gifts, leaving her as helpless as any other mortal woman. "I have to restore the binding." Dutch fired his rifle at one of the shadow forms, the muzzle flash brilliant in the supernatural darkness. The bullets passed harmlessly through shifting darkness, but the gunpowder smoke seemed to cause the entity to recoil slightly. Iron and saltpeter, old protections that worked on older threats. "The weapons!" she shouted to the terrified women. "Metal and fire, they still remember what hurt them before." But even as she spoke, Naia felt the terrible truth settling into her bones. These entities had been bound by the combined will of a dozen medicine workers, all of them at the height of their power, working together in perfect harmony over the course of many days. She was one broken woman with burned-out gifts, and the Cherokee warriors outside were scattered or worse. Through the cracked walls, she heard something that made her heart stop entirely. Kaya's voice, raised in a scream of pure agony. The spiritual feedback hadn't just affected the warriors. It had torn through every blood connection Naia maintained, and her sister was bearing the brunt of forces that would kill her within moments. "No." Naia staggered toward the stairs, but Thornfield's massive hand caught her arm, his grip like iron despite the terror she could see in his eyes. "You fix this," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "You put these things back where they came from, or I'll feed your sister to them piece by piece." The threat was meaningless now. Kaya was already dying from the spiritual damage, and these entities cared nothing for Thornfield's commands. They had been imprisoned in darkness for generations, and now they were free to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. One of the shadow forms turned toward Naia, and she felt its attention like ice water flooding her veins. It recognized her as the one who had broken their prison, but there was no gratitude in its regard, only the promise of eternal servitude as payment for her failure. She had sought to save her family, and had instead doomed everyone in the territory to something infinitely worse than Thornfield's brutality. The hall filled with the sound of splintering wood as the entities began tearing through the compound structure, seeking the other humans cowering in the cellars below. Outside, the blizzard howled with renewed fury, as if nature itself was trying to flee what had been unleashed. Naia closed her eyes and felt the last of her strength drain away, leaving her hollow as a broken vessel. She had lost everything: her power, her people, her sister, and any hope of containing the ancient evil she had accidentally freed. The darkness was only beginning,